Wrestling with God, always a bad idea.
Cue the wrestling intro music because this Sunday's lectionary text comes from the high ropes. We got a wrestling match, Jacob wrestling with God or some mysterious character. We're going to talk about this coming Sunday's Narrative Lectionary. And since it's a narrative, let's remind ourselves, last week we just had Abraham and Sarah chatting with some divine visitors. And now we're fast forwarding to Genesis chapter 32. So from 18 to 32. A few things have happened since then. Abraham had some kids, Isaac. One of them had a bit of trauma around, a hike with dad. And then Isaac's kids, Jacob and Esau, there's a whole lot of great story there, have a feud. Jacob runs away, sleeps on a rock, finds a stairway to heaven. On his way back home to finally reconcile with Esau, we have this story. So Adriene, this is the very infamous, people probably are familiar generally, Jacob wrestling with God. There's a whole lot happening here. What's the specificity of this text that you are looking at, and then what sort of ideas have you got for how you might be preaching it?
Yes, so wrestling with God, always a bad idea. So that's one tack that I'm taking. Like, why do we do it? Why do we continue to do it? Why do we think we're going to win? It puts me in mind of this musical called Your Arm's Too Short to Box with God. I don't remember who wrote that, but I think there's a song also with that same title.
He said, "How your arms are too short. Your arms are too short. Your arms are too short. Well, your arms are too short. I was sleeping and I had to scream, but you better hear this boy and scream. Your arms are too short. But your box is not
I'm in that sort of mindset where I'm thinking about the ways that we fight back and resist. It always also makes me think of my kid when they were little and didn't want to rest, didn't want to take a nap. That whole wrestling and the whole hip out of socket. Like, if you would just close your eyes, if you would just let God be God, this would go so much better for you. So that's like one tactic I'm looking at. The other thing that I always love in this text is the naming ceremony, the humility that it takes to let God rename us. I mean, that takes us into so many rich places just in terms of various cultural and ethnic traditions, naming ceremonies. But what does it mean? What do our names mean? And how we name God, how God names us, beloved, how we call ourselves children of God, followers of the way, all of the different ways that we name is also got me intrigued as well.
I was keying in on that too. I'm not preaching this text, but that's where my mind was wandering, because that's one of the very concrete, next things that happens for the rest of this character's life. He's no longer known as Jacob, but he's known as Israel. And so maybe just to pause on those names, Jacob means supplanter or trickster. And that's exactly who we saw Jacob being throughout the entire narrative previous. He was the one who deceived his brother Esau, and then he was tricked by his uncle with this whole wife swap situation that went on later. It's a really interesting story. So his identity as the trickster was what we saw for the first portion, and then here on his return home, finally coming back to the place he had been running for his life from, God gives him a new name, Israel, which means you have wrestled with God. And it makes me wonder, okay, so there was just a wrestling match that happened, whether it was a dream or whatever, but Jacob's whole narrative seems to be one where he's been wrestling, and now finally he is returning back to this place, returning back to God to some extent. So I'm with you there on the name change, and names carry so much significance, especially in these Hebrew scriptures, but this story in particular.
Oh, for sure. And what you just said about wrestling and so much of his life being characterized by wrestling, I think also invites us to think about the human condition. We are wrestling. There's just so many things happening in the world right now with the climate, with politics, with COVID on the rise again, so many ways in which we wrestle, often against, I think, our best interests, ways in which we push back against what God is trying to invite us into, ways in which sort of looking back at Abraham and Sarah, that we try to orchestrate or say, oh, I'll just help God out here, And God's like, I don't need your help, right? I'm God, remember? But I think that is the question that gets shot throughout these stories, comes out of last week's text, that question of, is there anything too hard for God? Is there anything impossible for God? And I think what humanity proves time and time again is that we just don't quite believe God's got it. We've got to help out. So wrestling, I think, is just an ongoing theme, not only for Jacob but for the rest of us as well.
Well, there are definitely lots of entry points,
Mm-hmm.
and Jacob's narrative is vast, and there's a whole lot you could touch on, but we're dropped into this particular moment of Jacob's story. How do you handle that, just as someone who is inviting our Riverside congregation into this narrative lectionary? Will you just drop us into Genesis 32? Will you give us a bit of Jacob's narrative? Like, what's your kind of approach, just from a Christian education kind of point of view of how we learn about the Bible?
Right. No, I definitely think we need some context. Otherwise, it's like, well, where did this kid come from? Who's he connected to? And these stories, as you know, are very much about the networks and the connections, because we're working our way through these beginning stories and all of what they have to say about what comes later. And so I think what helps some of the richness and beauty of these stories to unfold for us is knowing who Jacob is and who his father was. And when we say the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, then it's like, oh, this is communicating something much richer and deeper if you know that that's grandpa, dad, and son. Yeah.
Yeah, because there's always that kind of juggling two things at once with the narrative lectionary. It seems you're coming across to, this text says something and let's explore it, but we're also
Mm-hmm.
trying to invite you to hold something grand and all these potentially disparate pieces as a cohesive storyline, and this to that. I mean, the narrative lectionary doesn't make it easy when we're skipping chunks of pages at a time here, but I guess
Right.
they got to kind of keep us moving to keep on schedule with the
They
new
have to keep
year.
us moving, but I mean, there's no Isaac. It's
Yeah.
like it's Abraham and it's Jacob, and it's like, what happened to Papa? He's not in the story. He's still in Sarah's womb, and now we're
Now
gone,
we're,
and his
yep.
son has children, and people are like, wait, I'm missing something.
And
Yeah,
next
this.
week is Moses at the burning bush. So it's like we just go and
Oh
go. We're
wow,
hitting some good big hits. I love them,
we
but there's
are.
so many dots you have to connect
Yeah.
along the way.
You got to connect some dots. And usually I feel like the narrative lectionary does a good job with that, but maybe this year it's there was a book we read as a child where people would put on these boots that would take you like 7 miles. I don't know, but anyway, we're taking these big giant steps through the
Mm,
Bible this
mm.
year. Yeah.
We really are, which I mean is not. There's nothing wrong with that, because there's a lot
Mhm.
to survey, and at least it invites us to recognize there's a connection and a through line, and this came from
Yeah.
somewhere and goes somewhere, and hopefully people who are encountering the narrative lectionary feel that dissonance. Hey, wait a minute. So what did we miss in between? And then
Mm,
maybe that even sparks them to pick up the book and read it for themselves. What a novel thought. Christians reading the book outside of Sunday
right.
morning.
Right, exactly. I will say this, though, about the narrative lectionary, because we are still making that chronological journey. So it is, I think, easier for the one who's preaching to weave that together, as
Yep.
opposed to what we get in some of the other lectionaries, which is hopping and skipping around and circling back, and things are out of time order. So um, I think it's easier to fill in the gaps than it is to try to, okay, now we're back 500 years, and now
Yep.
we're going, yeah, so I just,
And like the beauty of it is you have to just do it long enough. It's a 4-year narrative lectionary cycle, so the next year we'll get another kind of pathway across the narrative, and the
yeah,
plane takes a different route, and so you look out your
right,
window and you can kind of begin to piece together the geography of the story into a beautiful, well, sometimes beautiful, just an interesting whole. At least some of these
definitely
stories are just
interesting.
very interesting, but yeah.
Yeah, yeah, some of them are disturbing. Yeah, last week was disturbing and rough, but yeah, you're right. I think that is the beauty of just the text in general, is that it's all in there. It's
Yeah.
not cleaned up for nicety's sake. We get the full scope of humanity, how we are, and what we could be. So.
Well, there's going to be more coming because the Narrative Lectionary, it keeps narrativing. Is that a word? Narrativing? It is now. And we have a lot of good things coming to the pulpit at Riverside, coming to the pews, whether you're in the room or online. So join us this coming Sunday to hear what this sermon turns into. It's going to be another good one, 11 a.m. on Sunday morning Eastern Time, up in the Upper West Side, West Harlem part of Manhattan, or on the internet, wherever you might have the internet, trznyc.org. Would love to see you in person or online. And Adrienne, always fun to dive back in and to see where these texts might be taking you and all of us.
Yeah, thank you. It's always great to talk about it, think about it. It really helps me to get ready for the next week. So thank you all for being a part of this. Otherwise, Jim and I would just be talking to ourselves, which is not a bad thing. It's not a bad thing, but it's nice to.
But we love when you all talk with us. You're in the comments. We see you, Lorraine. We got you, Dr.
Right.
Anderson. You're with us here. So drop your comments, your questions, your ideas. What does this wrestling text kind of evoke or bring up in you? Give Reverend Thorne a helping hand here. You might find yourself quoted in the sermon, or just, let's all keep learning together. It's going to be fun.